Hello, I'm Shotaro Tamai. Let me start with a question. Do you think what do these numbers represent? The numbers on the top are dates, and the numbers on the bottom represent the number of students. These numbers show how many students submitted the script for the midterm presentation in this course on the submission deadline. Students who never submitted their script are not included in these numbers. Of course, there is nothing wrong with submitting on the deadline, as it is still within the submission period. I also know that many students work diligently on their presentations until the very last day. However, I imagine that some students struggle to find the motivation to start and only begin working in a rush late at night on the deadline day. Today, I would like to talk about why we procrastinate and how we can overcome it. Procrastinate means to delay or put off doing something that should be done. In many cases, procrastination is caused by the way we think. In other words, by changing our mindset, we may be able to prevent procrastination. The aim of this presentation is to understand why we procrastinate and to consider how we can overcome it. First, it is important to note that procrastination does not necessarily mean that a person is irresponsible or simply unmotivated. So what causes procrastination? Here's a table of contents. In this presentation, I will mainly focus on psychological approaches, such as how we perceive tasks and our mindset. Now, let's look at how the way we perceive a task can affect procrastination. I'll explain this using the following experiment. In the study, university students were asked to reply to an email about everyday activities within 3 weeks. There were actually two different assignments. One group was asked to provide only general factual information, while the other group was asked to give more specific details, such as the personalities of the people involved and their relationships. Simply put, the second assignment was more demanding. However, the group that received the more specific assignment had a higher completion rate than the group that received the more abstract assignment. The researchers concluded that thinking about a task in more concrete terms helps people realize how much time and effort it will require. As a result, they are more likely to start earlier, which reduces procrastination. Next, I'd like to introduce another study related to mindset. In this study, 296 participants were divided into groups based on how much they procrastinated. They were then asked whether they believed the stress they were experiencing now would decrease in the future or remain the same. People who expected their stress to decrease could be considered relatively optimistic, while those who expected it to stay the same could be considered relatively pessimistic. The results showed that the group with low level of procrastination largely overlapped with the group that believed their stress would decrease in the future. The researchers suggested that optimistic people are able to think about the future more positively than pessimistic people. As a result, they find it easier to think about their tasks in concrete terms, making them less likely to procrastinate. As I mentioned earlier, thinking about a task more concretely appears to be one of the most important ways to reduce procrastination. Finally, I'd like to talk about how deadlines can lead to procrastination. Many people believe that deadlines motivate us to work because they create a sense of urgency. However, deadlines that are too far away may actually have the opposite effect. In one study, participants were asked to complete a simple online survey under one of three conditions. a 1 week deadline, a 1 month deadline, or no deadline at all. The researchers investigated how the length of the deadline affected the completion rate, which condition had the highest completion rate. The results showed that the lowest completion rate was in the 1 month deadline group, while the highest completion rate was in the non-deadline group. A deadline that was as long as 1 month seemed to encourage people to procrastinate, and many even forgot about the task altogether. In contrast, even without an official deadline, many participants appeared to assume that there was an implicit deadline and felt a sense of urgency to act immediately. Before I conclude, let's go back to the purpose of this presentation. The aim of this presentation is to understand why we procrastinate and to consider how we can overcome it. Through these studies, I found that the following strategies are effective in preventing procrastination. First, think about your tasks in a concrete and specific way. Second, maintain an optimistic mindset. Third, set deadlines over appropriate length. The third strategy I mentioned, setting deadline over appropriate length, is often difficult to put into practice because in many cases we cannot decide the deadlines ourselves. However, it is a very effective strategy when we make our own study or work plans. One of the main reasons we procrastinate is that we fail to think about our tasks concretely. As a result, we feel psychologically distant from them and end up thinking, I can always do it tomorrow. As long as we only think about finishing our tasks without understanding why we procrastinate, procrastination will remain a difficult enemy to overcome. However, now that we know the reasons behind procrastination and the strategies to prevent it, we may realize that it is not as difficult to defeat as we once thought. By maintaining an optimistic outlook, we can evaluate our workload more realistically. Then, by thinking about our tasks in a concrete way, we can clearly recognize what we need to do right now and find it easier to get started. The way we think can change at this very moment. As a first step, let's begin by changing the way we think about this semester's final exams. Here are the references. Thank you for listening.